Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am delighted to restart our exploration of Louis Sullivan's work. And this is one of my absolute favorite works by him. This is a system of architectural ornament. It is a very short work, and there is very little text in it. But that text is very powerful, and it is illustrated visually. So he's actually showing you how form follows function. How do you have a true function, and how do you build forms based on it? What are the principles of doing that? So it's a very deep work. And I'm delighted to have Sherri and Rob and Rupali and Joia and Maritza being panelists here. So the format we have is going to be all the panelists talking, but Sherri declared that she and Rob are going to take over this first meetup. So I have no idea what they're going to do. I know that is going to be magnificent, but I don't know what it is. All right, so I invite you to join in this exploration. On the meetup page, you'll find a link to a PDF of this entire rare book. Now, this book is not under copyright, so I have taken my own copy and I've digitized it, and you can look at it and you can follow along. I recommend going through it many times as we explore this book in this fashion. All right. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sherri and Rob. Over to you, folks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm so glad you guys could join us. A couple details that Shrikant hasn't mentioned about Sullivan's book is that it is a folio-sized book, which means it's what, 24
it's like
4 inches high?
Yeah, 11 by 17 somewhere.
And something like 14 to 16 inches wide. So it's a big, large volume. Large in size, and it's very short. Like Shrikant said, I believe it has 24 pages of text, and the rest is illustrations. It's a book that was published in 1924. I'm getting all my dates mixed up. 1924. So this next year is going to be its 100th anniversary. So we're timed really nicely about this too, because when you start seeing in the news some updates, maybe some articles about Sullivan's work, this is the last book that he wrote. He died in 1924. So you'll be able to have a much greater knowledge of its importance when you get to see some of these articles that will inevitably come out next year. But if you joined us for our talks through Sullivan's two of his other works, Kindergarten Chats and Autobiography of an Idea, this idea of a seed germ is very important in Sullivan's work. And we wanted today to steal Shrikant's stage and show kind of not the seed germ of Sullivan's work, but the seed germ of the seed germ. So we're going to start with that today. We've got a
screen sharing.
Yeah, you can start screen sharing. We have a good slideshow it's got a lot of pictures in it. They should be really fun and exciting. And part of our hope here is that we can very much surprise Shrikant, because that's ultimately all of our goal, right? Because he's so well read. But I believe this is going to be a surprise to him. So we're starting here with Remember the Seed Germ. And if you've had, oh, by the way, what I was going to say about this book, many colleges, you have to check your local colleges and libraries. You may find that they have a copy of this in their special collections. We have one at University of Virginia right near us, and we can go make an appointment to spend a couple of hours with this book. I really recommend it, because seeing it in its original printing.
I spent about 45 minutes with it. She spent a couple of hours.
Yeah. So So here we are with remembering the seed germ. This is Sullivan's illustration and his text. This is his hand lettered text in this section. But the next slide here is one of the first pages of that book, talking about the germ and the seat of power. And so I'm relying a little bit here on some of knowledge that several of you have from our works through the autobiography of an idea and through kindergarten chats. But I'll read this in case you can't see it completely because it might be too small on your screen. Sullivan writes, above is drawn a diagram of a typical seed with 2 cotyledons. The cotyledons are specialized rudimentary leaves containing a supply of nourishment sufficient for the initial stage of development of the germ. The germ is the real thing, the seat of identity. Within its delicate mechanism lies the will to power, the function which is to seek and eventually to find its full expression in form. The seat of power and the will to live constitutes the simple working idea upon which all that follows is based. As to efflorescence. And so efflorescence in this term is the flowering of, so it's the flowering of the idea. So what we wanted to start here was looking at some of this seed germ of the seed germ and some of these ideas that have a similar core kernel of this idea that Sullivan has. So what we wanted to try here was we're going to pull up, I think it's 5 images of objects or decorative arts, and see if you guys can look at them, and we'll go through them slowly, then we'll come back to them. What I'm hoping for you to do when you're looking at them is jot down in your notebook the date that you think these were made.
Just to put these in sort of
Just to get in historical context. So just so you know, this book comes out 1924. So here we go. This is a toast rack.
So you could probably use it as a letter rack.
Yeah, you probably could. This is a teapot. This is another teapot.
And if you can't tell, that hole in the middle goes all the way through.
Yep, that square in the middle goes right straight through it. And this is a wallpaper border. And this is a sugar bowl.
A footed sugar bowl in a very little way.
So give you a second to think about them. And we're going to come back.
Right.
And if anybody wants to unmute and throw out a date, or maybe we should just ask Shrikant.
Yeah, throw out dates. That's when you think these would be from.
Oh, Shrikant, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Folks.
Yeah, we'll do a Shrikant pop quiz.
Yes, what we can do is we can either put them in chat. That will give a opportunity for many people to put it down. So let's just go number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, like that.
Yeah,
so
we're going to go through them in order. So what do you think on this one?
Go ahead and put a date in the chat. Go ahead, folks.
I don't know that we can see the chat.
We probably can. Yep, here we are. I can't get your
but
screen to work.
The problem is you can't see the cursor.
I can't see the cursor. Well, Shrikant.
No, wait, we can see it now.
Yes, I'll read it out.
Yeah.
1910.
Okay. And what's your guess, Shrikant? We're going to put you on the spot.
I would say 1990.
Okay.
1990.
Penny is 1910.
Should we go?
Yeah.
Okay.
You see, you did this, Robin. I don't know how to.
I don't know what's going on.
Can I guess?
Go ahead, Rupali.
I think it's in the 19.
Oh, wow.
It's 1881.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
The next one. Anybody have a guess? Just shout out what anybody says.
1860.
See, now people are adjusting their estimates.
No,
Well-
I had that written down.
Oh, she did. Yeah, okay. And we can't see this.
We can't
'cause
see
it's-
this because, okay, because of the, where the, we can.
It's down here, 1879.
1870,
Ebony, go ahead.
this one,
This one,
No, it's for the next one you had moved.
1920.
also 1879.
Wow.
And this
the
one,
wallpaper border,
1920.
does look Art Deco, doesn't it?
1874.
Hmm.
The last one,
A footed sugar bowl.
1915.
1864.
Now, just to put 1864 into context, this is the wrapping up of the Civil War in America. And Louis Sullivan was 8 years old.
And someone was out there designing things that looked like this. All right, so these are,
Yep,
Yeah.
this is Rob's part.
these are all the designs of one 19th century designer. It's this guy, Christopher Dresser, 1834 to 1904. So for context here is Sullivan's born in 1856. So this guy was, 22 years old and actually very actively working.
The height of his career at that time.
Well, his career was just launching at the time that Sullivan was born. And Christopher Dresser is a really interesting guy. He's a guy, now the experience we just did there, this little thing of see these things, guess their dates, and then find out what the real
We
dates
went
are.
through this ourselves.
Well, this is it's an attempt to recreate what I went through more, I think, than Sherri did, which is about like the 19 years ago now, we were in London, visiting London, and we went to the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is this sort of museum that focuses on art and also especially on the decorative arts. And they happen to have an exhibit on Christopher Dresser there. And this is a book from the exhibit, and it was called "Shock of the Old," which I think is a very appropriate saying. But so what happens in this exhibit on Christopher Dresser, and I had no idea I'd never heard of him before. Sherri had a little bit of an idea. So she said, we have to see this. So we walk into it, and I come up to a display case that has a number of these teapots and things like that. And I immediately go, oh, this is, 1930s Art Deco. And I go up and start reading the descriptions and start seeing the dates and everything and realizing this is 1870, 1880, how early this was for something that looks like it was done in 1924, 1930, somewhere in there. So that was my introduction to Dresser, and it really was very literally the shock of the old, of realizing that here is this guy who was designing this stuff, 50 years ahead of his time. But the thing I didn't realize even as much then, but I've come to realize after studying this guy, is that Christopher, this wasn't just some one like lone guy out there, lone visionary who was unknown and he was so far ahead of his time, nobody knew what he was doing. He was actually extremely well known, very successful in his own day. And the objects we just looked at, these teapots and sugar bowls, things like that, these were mass produced in large quantities. And the thing that strikes me about it is if you would ask somebody to say, what is Victorian design? Picture in your mind, what do you think Victorian design looks like? You'd have something completely opposite in your head. And yet this guy was a giant figure in industrial design and decorative arts, right in the middle of the Victorian era. So we sort of have this sort of idea of what's Victorian, but there's this stuff that's going on that's very much the opposite, that was very popular, very successful. And
I was just going to point out, Dresser is actually quite possibly the first industrial designer. And he's born in 1834, the exact same year as William Morris, both British. So you can kind of see there's quite a difference between the two in their viewpoints. If any of you are familiar with William Morris, we'll get to him. We'll get to him more later. But if you're already familiar with William Morris, that thought of two processes can be running through your head throughout this.
So she mentioned that Dresser is the first full-time independent industrial designer. And I said he's very successful. So he actually worked with, I think, 50 different companies.
More than 50.
Hundreds of designs, and he did all sorts of things. So we've seen wallpaper and metalware and so far, but he also, this is a collection of his things. He also did ceramics, he did
Glassware.
he did we got some other examples here. There's an example of ceramics, there's an example of glassware that he did. He did this is a cast iron, this is again at the Victoria and Albert Museum. By the way, there's a reason he's at there's lots of, we encountered him at the Victoria and Albert Museum because it has a direct connection to him that we're going to talk about in a moment. But this is a cast iron bench.
And if you look,
bench.
you can see up close these flowers, and it's like growing seeds.
And then he also did furniture and fabrics. So this is both at the same time. It's a piece of furniture he designed with a fabric that he designed in this peacock feather kind of way design. And then there's another thing about him, which is that, not only did he work with all these different companies, but he was one of the first people, possibly the first person, to have his stamp put on as a designer. So not as the manufacturer, but as the designer on all of these things. So you see this CW dresser.
These are all the bottoms of, like this green one is the bottom of a ceramic vase. These other two are the bottom of metalwork, silver or other metalwork. And you can see all the other imprints on there, these little squares and the letters in the middle. And these symbols at the bottom on this one on the left, these are all the symbols of the makers. But quite prominently in there is all of these individual signatures from Dresser. And what's interesting, this one in the lower right, you can see designed by, and it says Dr. C. Dresser.
And later in his life, he made a big point of he was Dr. Dresser. And the reason was because
You want me to do this?
I'll do it. I thought you were going to do this.
Okay, the reason is because he started design school when he was 13, and he both studied design and botany.
So concurrently, he studied design and botany. So
with this particular drawing, you can see the few things here written in Latin in terms and things like that. This wasn't just a dalliance in botany. This was serious research. And eventually he was given an honorary doctorate in botany because of special work that he had done in research on morphology and what's the other word? Well, let's get to this. So this is some of his drawings of the sections of the ovaries of plants over here on the left.
And on the right is it's a wallpaper.
One of his wallpaper patterns, yes.
So you can see how he's drawing on the botany he's doing botany and design in school at the same time, studying them concurrently.
We also have his cataloging of the ways that leaves and plants break off and form more complicated plants. This is part of that study of morphology and metamorphosis in plant material.
Metamorphosis was a retrieval.
Yep, I found it finally. And he was elected into the Edinburgh Botanic Society, as well as elected as a fellow in the Linnean Society. So these were this was just a serious level of botany and biology that he was studying. He then used this knowledge to teach at the design school. So he was teaching at the design school botany and design together. So this is an illustration from some of his lectures that was about plant stem forms. And if you've done any sneak peeks into Sullivan's work that we'll be going over, Sullivan does the same thing in his work. Now, this is fairly faint, but let me read some of this for you. This is Sullivan. And he writes that he's got these leaf forms at the top column, or the top row, and it's titled Manipulation of the Organic. And underneath it says simple leaf forms. By manipulation, any of these forms may be changed into any of the others through a series of systematic organic changes known technically as morphology. And then underneath the second row of compound leaf forms, Sullivan writes, derivatives of the above technically, but organically, expressions of differing identities of the seed germ. So we'll be diving into this in coming weeks, very, very detailed of what Sullivan is doing. But Sullivan wasn't the first to do this. This is another drawing from Dresser that he had during his lectures to his design students on both botany and on design. It was using design as a way of identifying good design. One of his quotes from this time, there's some ellipses in this, but for simplification, I have it written this way. Botany, as adapted to the arts and art manufacture, suggests that the laws of science were becoming more simple and definite, since the apparent mysteries are now vanishing away, being superseded by simple truths. So again, if you've done a little sneak peek into Sullivan, you'll see kind of a similar idea of taking these initial stem forms and how they grow naturally. And this is what Sullivan is doing in his book. And he writes at the top, axes with or without sub-axes selected at random. And you'll see this suggestion at the top of different ways that plant forms could grow. And he writes, there is always supposed to be a main axis, however much it may be overgrown or overwhelmed by the vitality of its sub-axes. Herein lies the challenge to the imagination. And then the second row of plant forms growing off, he says, these arrangements may be continued indefinitely. There is no ending in values. And always he ends with, remember the seed germ there at the bottom. And you notice in this particular case, he's showing you the axis of the seed germ. Now, Dresser was a very serious educator of these ideas. And this is an illustration that the V&A owns, the Victoria and Albert Museum. This is one of Dresser's students, a young woman who was taking his classes, and the point of the class or the illustration was to take a natural form, and you can see her two natural forms up in the top section of this drawing, and to use that as an inspiration for a decorative motif. And so I'll zoom in on that for you so you can see what she was doing here.
And by the way, we should mention a little bit about the V&A.
Yeah.
So the Victoria and Albert Museum is the current name for what was originally the South Kensington Museum.
Mhm.
But it was the place where Dresser was teaching. And they had a school that they formed there in the early 19th century, specifically for the purpose of bringing, teaching design ideas to a new generation of people who are going to go out into the world of industrial mass production and basically provide industry with good design advice. And so Dresser was in a way their most successful student, most immediate and successful student, because that's exactly what he spent his whole career doing. But that's why there's a big collection of this at the Victoria and Albert Museum, because this is his home base.
But one of the things that we wanted to do is, since we're talking about the seed germ of the seed germ, was to talk about the one step further behind, who was Dresser's mentor. And
so while he's studying botany here, he's all doing it concurrently with design, and here's the guy he's learning from.
So this is Owen Jones, who was a British architect. And whereas Dresser he called himself an ornamentalist, what we would probably today call an industrial designer. They didn't have that term then. So he coined the term an ornamentalist. Owen Jones was his mentor. And Owen Jones was an architect and did a lot of, as it was common at the time, a lot of decorative arts as well. But Owen Jones produced this seminal work called The Grammar of Ornament. It too was a big folio-sized document, but not 24 pages long. This thing is like 300 and some pages. It's quite a big, beefy. If you ever can get to a special collection that has this, it is definitely worth seeing. And what he did is he took ornament from all around the world and was not looking at ornament from a hierarchical approach, but he was taking ornament and showing examples like these from all around the world in all different cultures, and was in the text describing how it is part of man's natural tendency to decorate with some level of ornament all of the things that we have in our daily life. And so he has a list of all the different
You've got the list all there.
Oh, I have the list here of all, and I'll let you flip through, just so you have a sense of all the different types of ornament that he addresses in the book. And of course, I can't show you them all, but we have African tribes, we have Maori, Egyptian, Assyrian, Persian, you can flip pages, Greek, Pompeii, Roman, Byzantine, Arabian, Turkish, Moresque ornament from the Alhambra.
Oh, that should go back there, Moresque.
Oh, well, they're all mixed in though. Indian, Hindu, which hilariously is spelled Hindoo,
Old spelling.
old spelling, Chinese, Celtic, medieval, Renaissance, Elizabethan, Italian, and then it ends the very end with a whole section of leaves and flowers from nature. But what you'll notice, there's no Japan.
Because Japan was still closed off.
Yeah, but we'll get to that later. You wanted to talk about this part.
So yeah, the idea of Owen Jones is sort of the Linnaeus of ornament.
And I'll flip back through so
And
you
this
can
is a
kind
very,
of look again.
it's a very common thing, this sort of Enlightenment idea that they've been doing in all sorts of different fields about this time, of there's a tremendous amount of knowledge becoming available, and people are then starting to sort of categorize it and collect it and put it all in one place and systematize it all. And that's what Owen Jones really does with ornament, is he says, okay, I'm going to take everything we have that's known. And notice also that, again, this is the Enlightenment, so it's, or just, the tail end of the Enlightenment. It's an era of exploration. So they're kind of finding the Maoris and going to India and China and all these places, everywhere except Japan, which will be important later. And then also they are, the travel has become much easier at this point. So that, it's a lot easier to go to these exotic places, these places very far away from England, and to come back, and for more people to go there than had ever been there before. I think you mentioned that there had been a trend in Britain towards Japanesque designs that were like based on this very crude and simple sort of bad
cartoonish,
of Japanese design, because very few people had access to the real thing. So people are starting to get access to the real thing on a lot of these designs from halfway around the world. And there's also, it's a period of archaeological exploration.
Yep, Pompeii.
So Pompeii is in here, and Assyrian ornament and that sort of thing. So they're starting to do a lot of archaeological digs and get a lot more accurate information about, well, what did Roman buildings really look like? One thing that I didn't know, and Sherri kind of clued me in on this, is that during the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, there were often attempts by the Europeans to copy what the Romans had done, but they had so little knowledge of what was really Roman. They would copy something that was actually medieval and think it was from, they didn't know how exactly things were done back in by the Romans. They didn't know how old all the different buildings, if you had a building that was a couple centuries old, they didn't know if that was Roman or who built it. So it was starting in the Renaissance, they start to get a lot more knowledge about what accurately are these historical styles. But you can see how this, at the time when historical, copying historical styles and architecture and design really kind of meant, okay, you had the classical, the Greek and Roman, and you have the Gothic, that this opens up the palette to, oh, you've got, all these different things. You've got the Celtic and the Vikings, and you've got the Maoris and the all these tribes in Africa, and you've got northern India, and you've got southern India, all these different things. It's all being opened up to this tremendous range of stuff. So it's sort of like Linnaeus coming along and coming up. He's the guy who comes up with the categorization system, the filing system that we use for naming different species and categorizing, okay, these species all belong together in this one family, and these belong over here. He's sort of doing that. He's taking all these ornaments, all these different kinds of design, and he's doing this broad survey and categorizing them and labeling them and making that knowledge available. Now, how is it used is the question.
Well, before we go to how it's used, one of the first things that happens is you can see how colorful these pages are. And these are big pieces of paper. And this is fairly early in the works of lithography, where you have to have a plate that's colored with ink, and then that is pressed on the page, and then you do another pressing of another color. And so lithography was starting at this time, but it's usually done with 2 or 3, if you're really extravagant, maybe 4 colors. Well, Owen Jones insisted on the work being done in this book that color was so and so important that he handled the lithography himself, or was very closely involved with it. And some of these pages have 20 plates. That means in order to print a single page, it had to go through the lithography, pressing, stamping category 20 different times for a single page.
To get all the colors on.
To get all the colors on. So of course, this made part of the effect of Owen Jones's work is that it became a luxury item to own one of these books. They were really, really rare. And very, very sought after because they were such gloriously printed things. But often when they were reproduced in a more affordable way, they were reproduced without the pages and pages of text that really described how this ornament came to be, how it reflected that culture, and most importantly, how to do ornament and how it should come out of the ideas of each culture. So I wanted to get back here to the leaves. Remember, they're very critical. The last chapter was about leaves and plants and flowers from nature. So on the left here, you have one of the plates from Owen Jones's book. And on the right, if you'll remember, this is one of Dresser's wallpapers. And if you look in the upper left of Owen Jones's page, you will see that particular leaf shape duplicated in Dresser's wallpaper.
Or look at the leaf shape on the lower left.
If you look at the lower left, you might recognize that, if you're studying Sullivan a lot, as this. This is some of the ornament from Sullivan's building, the Wainwright building in St. Louis.
So you were talking about, I think, about how, to me, you were talking about how when people saw these amazing colorful plates, they would just copy it, but they'd copy it kind of indiscriminately and mix and match and put it all sorts of different things. And, I think you said, somebody would, it became the rage that you would have an Egyptian smoking room.
Yes.
And then, you'd have a dining room that's done
Persian,
in Persian or Assyrian or whatever. And your description I thought was great. Is it's sort of like, if for those of us who might remember when the Macintosh computer first came out, that you saw people would print out post, because the Macintosh was the first computer available to the average person that had a whole bunch of different fonts you could choose from in the word processing file. And so it became very typical in like the mid to late 80s. You'd see somebody put out a poster or announcement, and they'd use like 16 different fonts all on one page. And why? Well, because we can, right? Because we now have this available to us, and we get excited and we get carried away with it.
So that's what happened with Owen Jones's work. And you know, that really, really probably upset him. And so part of what Dresser was doing when he was teaching at the design school was to try to say, hey, listen, there's a way that this happens. It's not just randomly
So it
placed.
sort of supercharges a kind of random eclecticism.
Go on.
But I think it also has another effect, which is I wanted to get to, which is I call the Miletus hypothesis, which is the beginnings of Greek philosophy. So I see she talks about the design stuff. I go into the philosophical and historical stuff. But in the beginnings of Greek philosophy come in the city of Miletus, which is where Thales and Anaximander were. And it's this, sort of it's part of the beginning of Greek civilization going on this new course, and specifically on this idea of coming up with natural explanations for the world that aren't just based on religious myth. And one of the theories for why this happened in Miletus is Miletus is a town, it's a Greek city, but it's on the coast of what's now Turkey. So it's sort of on the coast, on the Asian coast of the Aegean. And it was an area where they had the influence of a lot of different cultures coming in. So they had the Greek culture, you had the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Miletus had a little satellite city in Egypt where they had trade with the Egyptians. So they were very closely connected to Egyptian culture. So you had all these different cultures coming and mixing together. It creates a sense of, well, if everybody has different myths and different stories and different ways of doing things, maybe different ones are true, or maybe none of them are true. And it invites you to think about, well, what is the truth anyway? How can we come up with a basis of the truth that's not dependent on that's independent of these myths and traditions, and start coming up with, as Thales and Anaximander did, start coming up with naturalistic explanations. And I think that was part of the impact that Owen Jones had, and this knowledge of all these different kinds of ornament had, especially on Christopher Dresser, is this idea of maybe we can, instead of just mixing and matching all these things, maybe it invites us to think about what is the basis for ornament in the first place, and how do you generate it, and what should design be if we started from a clean slate.
So you've seen some of Dresser's designs that maybe are more what we might call proto-moderns.
Did you want to mention that we know that he studied in the Owen Jones?
Yes.
Also, that was it. One of the plates in here.
Yes, one of the plates in Owen Jones's book, Grammar of Ornament, was drawn by Christopher Dresser. Now I haven't been able to find the exact one, so maybe a later time we could pull that one up. And I might just pause here to say, if you put Christopher Dresser's drafting skill up against Sullivan's drafting skill, there's a clear winner, but still, there's a lot of interest between both of them, and where these ideas were. Let's just say it was fertile soil. So we've looked here at some of what the Grammar of Ornament, Owen Jones's book, had produced, and we're going to take a look at some of the possible directions that helped Dresser take. So this is a Mesoamerican vase. And this is a typical, they call it a stirrup vase from the ancient culture. It's a clay pot.
It's like Peru from the 950s or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
So this is a Christopher Dresser vase. Kind of, frankly, to me, it looks like a kettlebell. I can't, it looks like a kettlebell. Anyway, this is there. And again, you'll know there's a couple different things. It doesn't look like the same designer that maybe some of those other pieces were. By the way, those first 5 that we showed you, every one of those, I don't think we told them that. Every one of those was Christopher Dresser. And so is this. So part of the reason why we may not know Christopher Dresser today, as well as we know maybe Morris or Sullivan or Frank Lloyd Wright, is because he had a much wider variety of styles that he worked in. And this one has that touch to that Mesoamerican, but it also has what we'll get to in a little bit, a very Japanese style of glazing, which is a very traditional glazing style in Japan. And I know we've teased before, we'll get to Japan. This is another, this tube-shaped flower vase is also, they think, tied back to that Mesoamerican. Those were a new type of vase that hadn't been seen in the Western world before. So in this particular one, you've got a vase shape that's taken from one culture, and then this flower banding that happens across the top section of the tubes, that is very much a Japanese ornament style, like a block print on a fabric. So we're seeing Dresser taking far-flung ideas and aesthetics and pulling them together in a completely unique way. This is a cycladic vase, a stone vessel for pouring liquid, probably olive oil, from the Minoan time period, so 2200 to 1800 BC.
So these are Greek islands.
The Greek islands.
4,000 years ago.
And this is a Christopher Dresser picture. Very similar. Again, the glaze, maybe more Japanese.
But that picture, by the way, of the cycladic vase, that vase is in the British Museum. So
Yeah, this
obviously,
is
if it was something in London, you would have seen it.
Yep. Quite possibly, it would have been something that had been celebrated as a new discovery during his time. This is, we saw this one earlier. This is a Christopher Dresser glass work. He was heavily involved and very, very well versed in the manufacturing techniques. And in this particular case, this sort of pebbled glass, slightly milky in color, and the kind of gold streaks that go through it. These are reminiscent of the Roman and Venetian glass works that were recently being discovered. So he's got a tie in there as well. And sometimes he went completely fresh by himself into nature. This is a drawing of his on the left and a wallpaper or fabric sample on the right. This was wholly Dresser's design. And he'd written about it at the time. This was inspired by frost on a window pane. So he's not only taking all these different suddenly available ideas from all across the globe via what his mentor was producing, but he was also taking it completely fresh and new and from nature. But
and we've got another one, I think. So,
yeah, this one is also looks like flowers and leaves, and I believe this was inspired by bird wings. You can kind of feel that thrusting energy. This is one of my favorite of his drawings because it really is so full of life. But the other thing that he was really known for, and I alluded to it a bit ago, was his industrial. He was really tied to the Industrial Revolution and worked, like we said, over 50 different manufacturers.
He was well known among the manufacturers for having this very detailed knowledge of the manufacturing techniques.
They were very happy to work with him.
Because he was somebody who was designing, not just saying, here's something, now you figure out how to go to build it. He knew how the techniques worked, how the manufacturers worked, and he was designing with that in mind when he did a lot of this.
And so this is a letter holder. And what I love about it is this really almost whimsical love of the Industrial Revolution, this industrial power, because what would be more exciting and fun on your desk to have a letter opener that looked like cogs of a machine than one that you could actually fold up. So it goes from this point to this point. You can move all these pieces back and forth. He was also very determined to make sure that the things that he designed functioned. So the function of an item was really highly valued to him. I wouldn't call it, he didn't use the term form follows function, but he's getting in his writings to that same idea that Sullivan gets to. I would probably call it a focus on function. And so in his diagrams for his classwork and one of his books called The Art of Decorative Design, he goes into detail about the balance point of a vessel based on its shape. He's got several. This is just one of many descriptions, because these are more traditional vase shapes, but he goes into that in great detail. And
although you can see in this upper right that he has the sort of the existing shape of the
Yep.
pot, and then he has a sort of dotted line
Yep.
showing here's maybe where the handle ought to be.
Yep.
If we were to be pouring this. So
And
you can
so-
see that that shows up in his own designs.
And so you start seeing he really celebrated the pouring vessel and had quite a variety. So this is a water pitcher. And like I said before, a lot of his work have a little bit of whimsy to them. I think this looks like an anteater. But think about this being full of water and having that nice rounded strap that allows you to pour without, twisting your wrist in a really uncomfortable way. Makes it really ergonomic. And here's another. And you can see this is the combination of probably hand-blown glasswork or crystal, and sometimes they were silver plate, sometimes they were pewter. This one, I believe, is sterling silver. But he's always thinking about all the little details. So if you notice the top of this handle, that piece comes up and then it kicks back a little bit, but it's in the very, very top of the handle. It's completely flat. So when this vessel, when you open the lid comes back and sits plunk, right on the top of that handle. So it has its own support, which means that the hinge itself isn't getting torqued.
And by the way, she mentioned some of it's silver plate and some of it's silver, because the silver plate's important because this is, again, at a point where you're getting to industrial mass production. And it's industrial mass production that's going out to the new sort of rising middle class in Britain. So it's something that this is the sort of thing that previously would have been only made by a few silversmiths, handmade
one at a time.
One at a time by silversmiths, that is now being mass produced and often in silver plate, so that it's affordable. Instead of being affordable just to the very wealthy, it's affordable to everyone.
And this is one of my favorites. This is a claret vase, and if you know anything about claret, the red wine tends to have a little bit of debris in it. So if you notice the shape of this, what does that shape do? It helps to settle the debris nice and tightly down, the sediment down in the bottom of the vase, while still allowing the beautiful red color to have the light shine through it. It almost hides the sediment in the bottom of the vessel. And it's got those little feet, which I love. This one is one of my favorites. I love when people first look at that, they think it's just silliness. It's, why would it be this way? And oftentimes people will point out this little top, the little finial at the top of the lid. And of course, when you're making tea in a boiling hot water in a metal vessel, it's going to get really, really hot to touch. So that little necking helps dissipate the heat so that that little pyramid shape at the top isn't hot to touch. But the other neat thing about it is when you open up this lid, this side of the pyramid, I can't point here, the side of the pyramid that's facing the handle, when the lid opens up, that side of the pyramid rests perfectly on this flat part at the top of the handle. So it's just a lovely little perfect working. I want to point out the legs. We're going to show you the legs in the next vase too, but notice the legs on this little square teapot and this little round teapot. These little legs, they to me look like how a branch stem breaks off from a tree. There is a thickening and a widening to give more connection point from the vessel to the leg. And that to me is an example of his tying back to nature and how it functions and how it needs to connect, and really understanding the necessary scientific knowledge of the manufacturing process to make something that is actually going to wear well.
I was pointing out on this one that let's sort of set up the next slide, that we saw, especially like the first letter opener, that there's almost like a very stripped down, extremely modern style to some of this stuff. Now he has a range of different things. Some are more ornate, some are less. This one I thought was an example. It's like a salt and pepper set, or a cruet set. Cruet set. So this would be oil and vinegar and things like that for on your salad. But some of this is very stripped down, very spare, very, to our mind, very modern looking. But Dresser also had something that you don't always see in modern design, which is the next thing, which is a sense of whimsy. So this is another one of his. It's a letter,
probably a toast holder.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I had to find this picture of the unfurling fern fronds next to it. He just really does have that sense of whimsy about it. They make you giggle. And this one by far is my favorite because it's a sugar bowl. Now, in his documents, or in his drawing, in his books, in his classes, he talks about how these two little bands at the top of vessels of this shape help to give stiffness to the material and help in some way in the manufacturing process. But what I love about this, the whimsical nature of this little bowl, is that it feels to me like when you're having, your morning tea and putting a lump of sugar in it, that once you grab your lump of sugar, it may scurry off to the other end of the table all by itself.
You have to chase it around.
You have to chase it around to get your sugar lumps.
In a Harry Potter book.
Totally would. Yeah. And this was such a popular design that in 1993, an Italian housewares company reproduced this in plastic versions. So you can occasionally find these on places like eBay in plastic or polyplastic. I'm not sure what kind of plastic, but that you could use for dishwares, and it comes in black and yellow and green and blue, a little set of them. And then so they would scurry in all different directions on the table. And this one, again, another little set of whimsy, but also you see the spareness of it.
Well, the whimsy is
the whimsy is, this looks to me like my mom standing in the front porch with her hands on her hips saying, "It's well past dark. Where have you been?" And so I find this really that another sense of the whimsy to it. But the other thing that's important about this particular vase is, again, the glaze. And we've mentioned this glazing a couple of different times. And what's happening here is this is his influence from Japan. And do you want to stop share on this while we talk about this?
Stop share for a few seconds.
Okay.
I can't see the chat anyway.
I can't.
Stuff happening in the chat now. Okay. You have to hit escape first.
Okay. There we go.
And then stop share.
So then let's talk for just a second here about Japan. We've been teasing about it long enough. So as you know, Japan has been closed off at this point in time from the world until it was 1853. I don't remember the exact date, when they were finally, by gunboat diplomacy, requested to open up to the rest of the world. And it was some years later, in the 1870s, that Christopher Dresser, at the height of his career, was invited. This was a shock. Invited the first industrial designer really, invited to Japan to stay for more than 4 months at the request of the emperor, and to give complete access to all of Japan's manufacturing.
Now,
So
let me talk a little about why Japan was doing this, which is that they were, like I said, that they had been trading with very, very limited trade with the Western world, very closed off and very insular and very isolated. And then, I think basically what happened, my understanding of it, I haven't gone deeply into this. My understanding is basically the Americans said, "Hey, wait a minute, you can't trade with other people and not with us." So they basically sent Commodore Perry with a gunboat and said, "You have to open up." And it was kind of one of these shock moments for the Japanese culture that, we thought we were the center of the world. We thought we were really advanced. And then these people come along and they have these gunboats, and we, it's totally overwhelming. They suddenly realize we're far behind, we're actually behind everybody else. And so they made this huge push, and they would brought in all sorts of experts from the West and sent their people out to the West, searching to find out basically what do these people know that we don't, and trying to import as much knowledge and as much new technology and that sort of thing into Japan as possible. So they go through this very rapid, in the late 19th century, this very rapid modernization. Now, it doesn't always turn out well. So, for example, they sent their experts out to look at systems of government, and a bunch of them came back and say, "Oh, we found this great system of government in Prussia, and it's going to be this German system where the military is really in charge of everything." And so this doesn't end well. They don't always choose the right examples, but they were bringing in all these different experts, and that's why they would give this huge, go from being completely isolated to giving this amazing access to a British designer.
So on his way to Japan, because I mean, today we would just get on a plane and we would go Japan, or we would go from England to the East. But no, he has to take a boat from England to New York, take a train from New York to the West Coast, then take a boat from the West Coast to Japan. That's the way he has to travel. So when he does that, he stops in New York City and meets up with
1876.
Yep, meets up with Tiffany and Company's executives who hire him. So he now has two jobs. How nice is that? Two jobs. He is hired to go at request of Tiffany to Japan to bring back something like 20 to 40,000 items of goods for sale by Tiffany. So he creates this massive market, really, for genuine Japanese aesthetic goods, and not this sort of Japanesque kind of cartoonish quality of it.
Because when they first encountered it, they had very few samples to sort of make their best guess at it. Now, the interesting thing from my, you tell me if I'm right about this, is that my understanding too is that the Japanese have been doing the same thing, that they saw this European market, so they first started making goods that were basically Japanese copies of European style goods. So the European style decorative designs and things like that, they started making Japanese copies of that. And of course, they're not going to be as good as the ones manufactured in Europe because they don't have the traditions, they don't understand the ornament as well. And Dresser, one of the pieces of advice Dresser gives when he gives this report at the behest of the emperor, is he tells them, don't try to make copies of European things, make Japanese goods, make things that are in the Japanese style, that are in your own native style, and send that to Europe. And so he's responding, and then of course he helps open up that market by bringing back this huge number of goods for sale to this now eager European and American market for that.
And it's no surprise, really, when you know that detail, how it is that the arts and crafts architects and designers that come after Dresser, including Frank Lloyd Wright, who's heavily influenced by Japan. Yes, he makes his own trip there too. But all of these things kind of come because of Dresser's introduction to it.
Dresser is actually known as a key figure in what's called the Anglo-Japanese style. So it's this encounter that the English have with Japanese, and they bring back ideas.
Yeah.
And then I think we go back to screen share to show some.
Oh yeah, we got it. You have to do that. It's over here. Yours is different than mine.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we have this whole problem. She keeps asking me how to do things, but I have a MacBook and she has an iPad, so
I keep trying to touch the screen.
They're often in different locations.
So we're going to take a look at some of his Japanese influence, what happens when he encounters Japan and how it affects his work. So if you're familiar with historic Japanese objects, they're heavily influenced by nature themselves. They actually in their religion see God in the nature. So the vessel that you see on your right is a bronze replica of a traditional gourd, vegetable plant shaped. They hollow them out, and they can use them to pour. Well, that's a Japanese traditional vessel on the right. And what you see on the left here in this beautiful Japanese style glazing is a dresser piece.
You want to talk about the glazing?
Well, it's a traditional, the Japanese aesthetic in glazing is really spectacular. They do a lot of iridescent glazes, but also fire. They're glazed in a super hot environment, often ones that are not even, so that the glaze takes on different qualities that happen just naturally. And then that part of it is celebrated. The other part that's
Like
really
the variations of the glaze are the ornament.
that's the ornament.
Yeah, they
of
don't
it.
have an applied ornament. It's the variation of the glaze that becomes the ornament.
Mhm. The other thing that's really
And Dresser
common,
completely drawing from that. there.
Yes. The other thing that often comes now, this is a sea urchin vase.
Dresser design.
This is a dresser design, and you can see again that idea of the handle and how it would function. You see there's a little bit of a curve to that handle. And so I imagine that would be, they won't let me touch it. And it's behind glass at the museum. But I imagine it pours really gently, really nicely, feels good in the hand. And you can see that glazing pattern, and this is based on a sea urchin. But another element that comes from the Japanese aesthetic, which is quite different at this time from the British classicism aesthetic. In British classicism, you would have extremely strict symmetry. If the house had a door in the middle and there were two windows on the left side, there'd be two windows on the right side, whether the room made sense for that or not.
You can see this actually. I remember visiting Mount Vernon, George Washington's house at Mount Vernon, and there's one spot where there's a window. Well, there's one spot there where there are windows, but they're odd looking windows because they're basically, there's brick behind them. There's nothing behind them. They're there on the outside to make the facade balance, but there's actually nothing behind them. Or another place where there's a window, but right behind the window is a staircase, like the treads of a staircase. Because again, it had to be in that spot to make things balance, to have the symmetry, but it didn't actually make sense with what was going on in the house.
So Dresser's also introducing this element of asymmetry, which is so prominent in the Japanese aesthetic. And that ties very much into the Victorian era with this love of the eclectic. And, you know, you think of these Victorian houses, they're absolutely the opposite of symmetry. So that ties in there too. And then that simpleness of celebrating the nature of the very material. So this is a glasswork that's hand blown. So it has all of the spiral shapes that come from when you blow the glass and you spin it. It has all the little air bubbles in it. The way that the four little handles connect, where the pool of glass sort of widens out. All of these are celebrating the manufacturing details as the ornament.
This reminds me a lot of stuff we find at Blanco glass. There's a place in West Virginia called Blanco Glass, which is sort of became famous in the early 20th century. But they did designs that were very modern in the sense of very much like this, where a sense of, like, you know, the process of manufacturing and the natural variations of the glass are the ornament.
And then we get into
well, before we talk about Morris,
this is Dresser.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Before we get into that, I think we want to talk about a little bit more about his influence. You have the shop you opened.
Oh yes. So actually, part of how expansive his realm was in the design world, he actually opened a furniture or home decorating store called the Art Furnishers Alliance. It was open for about 3 years. It ended up closing partially because nobody knew what a furniture design store was. It was a little ahead of his time, but also there were some health issues that caused him to close that down. But as we were talked to you about earlier, Dresser was really hugely successful in his own lifetime, where a lot of designers aren't. But it's interesting that none of us really know him. He's not the name that we all know. And so we have been thinking about why is it that he was overlooked,
Well,
maybe.
talking about the role he had in his own time, because I mentioned earlier that he had his name stamped as a designer on a lot of these things. He wasn't the manufacturer, but there his name is. And I sort of described it as a brand, and you said that's not, doesn't seem quite right to you.
Yeah, I thought
Because branding is a very modern concept.
yeah, I think that what he was doing with getting that signature on the back of all of the items, not everything, but many of the items that he was creating, it was almost like an artist signing his work. And that was the first time that had ever really happened in the manufacture. I mean, yes, if you were doing Revere silverware in the 17th century or 18th century, you were signing your work, but you were making them one at a time.
And it was the craftsman who was actually making it, who was also the designer, who was then the person stamping it. It wasn't a designer as a separate person.
Yeah. So this was the first time that
But
was
you also
really
talked about the
happening.
aesthetic movement, the role of the aesthetic movement.
We might be getting a little bit. The aesthetic movement was something that really started at about the same time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It was a outcry of making things beautiful and meaningful in a time when some of the Industrial Revolution, some of the products that were being created were what everybody was seeing was devoid of any soul, or devoid of any
cheap
beauty.
But not well thought through.
Yeah, and I mean that's something we can all
So the aesthetic
see today, right?
So the aesthetic movement was this idea that everyone should have art in their everyday life in some way. And the thing is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, that was like a great idea, but really only a few people could afford to have really finely made, artistically designed pieces because they had to be made one at a time by a craftsman. So Dresser is a way of saying, yes, we can have that now because we can mass produce them. They're silver plated, not silver, and we can make them affordable for everyone.
And in his book, The Principles of Decorative Design, Dresser writes, "My object in writing this work has been that of aiding in the art education of those who seek a knowledge of ornament as applied to our industrial manufacturers." And he later writes, "There can be no morality or immorality in art, the utterance of truth or of falsehood. And by his art, the ornamentalist may exalt or debase a nation." So part of that aesthetic movement was trying to find value and morality, really, in the beautiful things in the world that were manufactured. Sometimes they were someone like Morris, who was looking to turn very much against the Industrial Revolution and against any manufacturing and to do it all in handwork. Dresser was very much doing the same thing while embracing all of that manufacturing.
Well, let's get to Morris versus Dresser.
So this is, you remember, Morris and Dresser are born in the exact same year. They're both British. They're both in this decorative, they're in the same field, doing wallpapers, glass, furniture, pottery, things like that. And if you read their text carefully, there's a lot of similarities between them.
And you would show some similarities in the design.
Yeah, and I want to show some similarities in the design. So this is on the left as a drawing of Dresser's, and on the right is one of his fabrics. And I wanted to read a quote from you, which is from Dresser. "Those arts are generally considered the most worth, in which the mental labor employed and the mental pleasure produced are greatest, and in which the manual labor or labor of whatever kind is least apparent." And keep that in your mind while we look at two examples from William Morris. This is two different ones of, well, these are both patterns that have been made both as wallpapers and as fabrics. And I have this quote here from William Morris. "If any of these things make any claim to be considered works of art, they must show obvious traces of the hand of man, guided directly by his brain, without more interposition of machines than is absolutely necessary to the nature of the work done."
So he's very anti-industrial.
So anti-industrial that he is famous for quoting for this quote: Apart from my desire to produce beautiful things, the leading passion of my life has been and is hatred of modern civilization. So there's a quite radical difference.
But the interesting
Between
thing
them.
is that maybe because of this, unfortunately, Morris is much better known than Dresser, even though they're from the exact same time period.
Highly
And
ironically,
go ahead.
highly ironic is that Morris was very much trying to create that for the masses, but through handcraft.
Morris was a socialist
Yes.
who, but his stuff ended up, because of his emphasis on hand craftsmanship, his stuff all ended up being very expensive and affordable only to the well-off. Whereas Dresser, who embraced industrial manufacture, his stuff ended up being
Available to
in
everyone.
large quantities and affordable to everyone.
Yeah.
So that's, but it is sort of an interesting thing that Morris got all the glory.
Yeah.
And I think maybe, well, you had a theory as to why he was taken more seriously by the intelligentsia, the cognoscenti.
Well, I think part of that is because he was in business. And I think that it was not considered art the same way that art would be considered as, something in a museum or something handmade. I also think that successful in his lifetime, that production that he was so fantastic at creating might have led to a little different influence. He was a lower level down in maybe the upper echelon would see his work as
It wasn't
for the
elite,
masses.
It wasn't elite
elite.
precisely because it was mass produced.
Exactly.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So now we have a couple of other little interesting comparisons. Now, we don't have factual basis that these are genuine connections because there's very little knowledge of direct influence in the architectural history. We have to see, we know that Dresser was influenced by Owen Jones because he writes about that, but we don't know all of these other architects that came after. We don't exactly have the knowledge yet of how much they were influenced by Dresser.
So you'll see claims out there that, Dresser, because he came to America in 1876, and there's a lot of claims that Dresser influenced Frank Furness and Louis Sullivan, but that we don't really have data, direct evidence. But we're going to go over this.
So on the left we have Frank Furness at the Pennsylvania the School of Fine Arts.
Yes.
And I like to pair this with, on the right, Dresser's wallpaper. And that is one of the wallpapers that is considered Anglo-Japanese. I find them really interestingly similar. And here on the left is a Dresser drawing. And on the right is a Sullivan. That's some of the detail from the Wainwright building in St. Louis.
Especially if you look at the upper right in the Dresser drawing.
Mm-hmm.
That
the little coil that comes around.
That looks very much like
this one.
Interest in.
And because I had to do more than one Sullivan, this is another Dresser drawing. It's a little blurry, I know, and it's a little faint, but keep that picture in your mind when I flip the slide to this, which is the frieze detail of the Wainwright building.
So it's hard to find specific evidence of connections, but on the other hand, Dresser was so well known at the time, and he was writing books and he was teaching, and his stuff was being mass manufactured, that it's a little bit like asking, I would say it's a little bit like asking somebody today, have you ever heard of Martha Stewart? Right? It would have been that level of exposure.
Yeah. This on the left is, again, it's Dresser's icicle. And on the frost panes on the frost. On the right is Frank Lloyd Wright's Tree of Life window. And to take this even well beyond Sullivan and Wright, this is a Christopher Dresser candlestick holder. And this little rocket-shaped thing on the left the cover lifts off and you can put your matches in there. And these ridges on the side are the striker for your match. So you've got everything you need in all in one place. And compare that to this Bauhaus teapot. They even have the same
1930-ish.
40s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, after the war. And here's a side-by-side comparison of Dresser's toast holder or a letter holder.
By the way, this one on the left, the toast holder, the Dresser toast holder. I think somebody mentioned 1990s for one of these things, and in the 1990s, there was this little like revival of mini revival of Dresser, and I think Alessi,
That's the Italian company that made the little
that
footed
made the
bowls.
little footed bowls. I think they also made this rack again,
Mhm.
based on his design.
And on the right, in green, is a toast or letter holder from the Bauhaus. But you notice, I see that there is a little more liveliness and fun in Dresser's drawings, where the Bauhaus gets utilitarian to the point of, notice the way the metal is bent at the bottom, where it's curled in and left that way. I mean, not that I would have changed it, but it just seems to have been sucked a little of its life out of it.
It's much starker and plainer.
And this is Rob's favorite.
Well, one of my favorites. Well, this is to show that he could do these things that were very, in a way, very radically modern and unornamented. This is another water pitcher. But at the same time, there's always a sense of sort of flair and of motion. And I really think that one of the influences Japan had on him was his pottery design has become much more sort of free flowing and sort of letting the clay just sort of flow in different directions. And so there's that sense of movement and playfulness to it that you don't see in this very stolid, square German Bauhaus stuff.
And then we take to the cover here of Dresser's book, Truth, Beauty, and Power. And if you look at the illustration, and then I don't know if you can faintly see the border around the edge of this leather-bound book, it feels just a lot like Sullivan.
Especially Truth, Beauty, Power, this sort of slogan.
Yes.
With a lot of the same ideas, yes.
So we come back to this germ. And I'm going to read this same line again. And having listened to us go on and on for like an hour and a half, sorry about that.
No problem.
Think about this seed of power and the germ in another fresh way. So I'll read again. Above is drawn a diagram of a typical seed with two cotyledons. The cotyledons are specialized rudimentary leaves containing a supply of nourishment sufficient for the initial stage of the development of the germ. The germ is the real thing, the seat of identity. Within its delicate mechanism lies the will to power, the function which is to seek and eventually to find its full expression in form. The seat of power and the will to live constitute the simple working idea upon which all that follows is based as to efflorescence. So as we've now gotten the seed germ, we get to now explore its flowering in the coming weeks. So this is the last page of Kindergarten Chats, where Sullivan tells us all to begin. And I leave us at Sullivan.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Sherri.
Welcome.
All right. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to have panelists make brief comments, and then we will turn it over for questions and comments from everybody else. So I have three things to say. I'm going to start with a quick introduction. Sherri, you had kept the whole thing secret for 3 or 4 months, but you almost gave it away yesterday. You said, yes. You said, did Louis Sullivan Truth, Beauty, and Power? I did all searches and said, wait, I keep coming up with this Dresser. Let me see if I should read it. But I said, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll follow it up with tomorrow and discuss that with Sherri, that, she must have it mixed up with somebody else. And
I
You almost gave it up, but I had other things I was trying. I wanted to reread.
Oh, thankfully he was busy.
Yes, I wanted to reread System of Architectural Ornaments. So you managed to keep it a secret. So it was just an introduction. I have 3 points. The first one is, I think this is beautiful, talking about seed of a seed. And the biggest point I see here in Christopher Dresser is his twin pursuit of botany and design.
Mhm.
That's a huge, huge point, because these people kind of drink in patterns of nature and then express it. My favorite example of that is a person who has done just that, just in botany, is the book on growth and form by Darcy Thompson, where he just lists all this great variety of patterns in nature, to see the patterns in all of them. And for all these people that we're talking about, that is the ocean from which they keep drinking and rejuvenating themselves.
Detail on that too, which is one of the things that Sherri came across in her research on something else, was about Thayer and camouflage.
Yeah.
That modern camouflage, the use of the military, comes out of an idea that came from an artist, Albert Henderson Thayer, who was also a naturalist, and observed. He wrote a little book on concealing camouflage in nature. And how animals camouflage themselves, and he tried to push, and it was rejected in the 1890s.
Yeah,
he was rejected. Oh no, this is ridiculous.
He brought this knowledge to the U.S. military, and they poo-pooed him and sent him away, telling him that he was nuts. So he went to the French, and the French took it and developed camouflage. We eventually wound up doing it too. Took us a while.
My second point is the work of Grammar of Ornament by Owen Jones. What he's doing is that he's doing for culture what Darcy Thompson did for biology. He's putting together, he's bringing to your focus the full richness of human creation, as opposed to just getting seeing one little building in Rome and say, okay, let me make a copy of it. This is like taking in all of Rome, taking in all of Greece, taking in all of Mesopotamia, just basically everything as a starting point. So that is kind of applying the same thing about what Darcy Thompson is doing to culture, to design. But the difference is that you have to drink deeply enough. If you just take a little bit of it and start copying it, then it's going to be just pale copies. You're not going to really think, because putting so many things together allows you to subtract things, of saying, look, this is really doesn't have legs, but this one has legs. These are the commonalities I see between all of this. In some ways, the power of myth, one that we are going to go through, is a version of that for mythology, of looking at patterns and just priming yourself with that. So that's the second point. And the third point I want to make is, connects up to Louis Sullivan. When I see this, the person that I have seen this do most is Leonardo da Vinci. And the idea there is that his drawing of nature, so it is the eye, brain, and hand, doing these loops again and again and again and again on the variety of nature, on the production, massive amount of production, that is really internalizing the principles of growth, principles of design, the laws of nature, building it into your circuits. I will conclude my comment with my favorite quotation from Autobiography of an Idea, where Louis Sullivan says, life began to break in upon him.
Yes.
Continuous breaking in from the outside and breaking out from the inside was to shape his destiny. So it is that fully open and fully ambitious. So there is humility of taking in everything that you see, and then the ambition to express it
Mhm.
fully, which is the heart of what this book is about. All right.
Yeah.
Next up is going to be Rupali, followed by Maritza, and then we will go to everybody else. Rupali, go ahead.
Wow. That's all I can say. I mean, it is such a beautiful treat to the eyes, to the soul. And Sherri and Rob, you did such a tremendous job of showing the man-made object with the inspiration from nature. I mean, that juxtaposition side by side pictures, they were really very helpful. I love the plate of the different shapes of leaves. So I don't know, but in the Montessori method, you have that as a material for children. And we take those shapes and go out in nature and look for those shapes, bring them back, and then children will draw them and work with them. A lot of this work, I think, done in the late 1800s. There probably must have been some form, some kind of a movement or something going on, because you see that in Maria Montessori's works, you see that in Louis Sullivan, you mentioned Dresser, Owen Jones. In Boston, we have the Harvard Museum, the Harvard Peabody Museum, and there are beautiful, there's an exhibition of glass flowers and the parts, and what these two glass artisans, they were German father and son duo, and they took flowers from, I mean, plants from nature, and they did cross sections, and you can see the geometry, and they're all done in glass. And that's an exhibit now remains, but they were made for botany classes. They were made to teach botany because you couldn't have the tropical flowers and the tropical plants, but once they were created in glass, you have it, and students could study them. So I think there must have been some element of using the same type of plates for different purposes at that time. And then this summer I was in India, and I knew we were going to be doing this book, and every time I went to see temples and mosques and different places, I couldn't help but think, oh my goodness, this is all ornamentation coming from the seed-germ, right? That there is, you can see the integrity of the design, like especially when I was at Taj Mahal, I could just see, okay, check, check, check every element that Louis Sullivan talks about or is in design theory. You can check them off. And I think what I'm going to be doing in my part, Shrikant, I don't know if it's okay for me to share now.
Please go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to take, I'm going to be talking about ornamentation in Indian architecture. To do this. And I really am so glad that you showed us all those plates, because you captured them all in one place. So thank you for doing that.
Yes.
And then the other part that comes to my mind is Maria Montessori's idea about the spiritual embryo. So Louis Sullivan talks about the seed and she talks about the embryo, but the idea being that we have the potential. It's in every human being, that same potential. And I love the idea of just flowering, that potential just coming to its full cycle. So thank you again. This was fantastic.
Well, I want to get a show of hands. How many people had heard of Christopher Dresser before this, other than Shrikant Googling yesterday?
Okay.
Like one person?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That's why I think is exciting about this is I think he's one of the most important people in the history of
that nobody knows
design,
about,
and he's virtually unknown today. So I think there's a lot of
it's changing. It is changing.
So one thing I should point out, there's a large collection of Dresser at Cooper Hewitt, the museum in New York.
That's why this
Shock of the Old exhibit came out of there. So they have a big collection of this stuff, and they've been trying to promote him since about for the last 20 years or so.
They realized
Yeah.
his importance. I want to mention something on both Rupali's comment and on Shrikant's. The where this comes from, and we talk about this before, like the soil, the rich soil. There is so much happening at this time period. We've got Charles Darwin, we've got biology being and botany being understanding plants at a biological level, which is a new thing. We're getting to study that in humans and starting to understand it in diseases and things of that nature. This is the time when everybody gets really crazy on all sorts of crazy diets, like the guy who comes up with a graham cracker ends up is creating this diet that's formed because you've got to keep your humors in order. There's a lot of weird things coming up, but then there's a lot of it being looked at in a scientific basis.
Good.
And I wanted to tie back into Shrikant's second comment from the Grammar of Ornament, and that people are using this as a pattern book. I see what Owen Jones creates, and there's quite a bit of text that goes with his 120 or 160 beautiful plates, but that text is ignored. And then along comes Christopher Dresser, who I didn't even mention, has published multiple books about ornament and how you design and how to do it. And his books are sort of lost as well. You have Sullivan doing the same thing, talking about ornament, how to design, and how you do it in a way that is true to the seed germ. And his is kind of what's happening over and over is that there is a lot of people who are willing to just use it as a copy, use it as a template, and not to dig any deeper. And I think of all of these books, one after another, what you can get of the values if you dig deeper down to the nut, to the kernel, to the seed germ. That's where the real serious knowledge comes from.
So one thing I want to throw in here, I wasn't going to save this for later, but since you brought it up, I'm going to say
did?
something very quickly about biology, which is,
talk.
I know, just one short thing, which is, I think the one thing we don't really appreciate from today's perspective is how enormously exciting biology was in the 19th century. I mean, came across an article, somebody was talking about how many people were naturalists at the time, like as a hobby, people who were in totally different fields, well-known in other fields, they were naturalists as a hobby. Because it was a tremendously exciting time in biology when all sorts of mysteries of life were being unlocked, and this huge growth of knowledge. And it was a real cutting edge scientific field. So I think that explains some of the excitement that comes up. Biology to the 19th century is what maybe like nuclear physics is to the 20th or something like. I'm trying to come up with a good analogy. But the other one small thing I might mention that is the role of illustration. And biology was very tightly connected to art at the time because the camera, the photography was still somewhat primitive. So how did you record things as a scientist?
You drew them.
You would make, I love this, I hadn't heard about this, glass models.
Yeah.
You do glass models to show something to students, or you had to be able to draw that, and you had to draw it really well. So another little detail on that is Beatrix Potter, who's known for the Peter Rabbit stories. She has beautiful illustrations. Her rabbits really look like rabbits, despite the fact they're wearing clothes and doing all sorts of crazy things.
And they have brass buttons.
Yeah. But they really look like rabbits. And the reason is because she was a biological illustrator. She was actually, there was a controversy where they refused to admit her into the Royal Society because she was a woman, despite the fact that she was very widely respected as a botanist. I think she did mushrooms, right? She did illustrations of mushrooms that were used for biology textbooks and for study by biologists. So again, this is an era where photography was still relatively primitive. And so art and biology specifically had a really huge overlap. And then biology being this super exciting field. So that explains how you get art and biology and ornament and all that mixing together so completely.
Yeah, and think about how important it was to be really, really accurate when drawing mushrooms. It was a life or death thing. It was life or death.
Right. So just throw that in.
Thank you. All right, folks. So we're going to have Maritza go next. And then would love to hear from everybody. Just go ahead and type an exclamation mark in chat. Would love to hear your reaction. So I'll just make one comment and then I'm going to pass it on to Maritza. What is it that sets Louis Sullivan apart from his predecessors like Precursor? That's also a very important question to ask, because while all of these people are inspired by biology, the depth, the human depth to which Sullivan goes in terms of the intellectual faculty, the emotional faculty, the moral faculty, and the spiritual faculty, he's actually showing you many levels of the human, volitional, conceptual consciousness and full scale. And his ambition is not just ornamentation, it is about transforming human society and the world itself. So he goes much deeper and much wider than most of the people. Yes, he starts with biology, but he goes far deeper into philosophy and things. So that's one comment I would make. Next up is going to be Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
Hello. So I am in the group of folks who were not previously familiar with Messer or Owen Jones. However, I actually will be at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2 weeks. And this time I will make it to the National Art Library. It has been closed the last 2 times I went. So this time I'm making sure to make it. And on my list, actually, Louis Sullivan did this book, this rare book. Actually, they have a copy. So I was going to get to see it in person there. But now I'm going to have to go and look and see Owen Jones and Dresser there too. So I just thought it was interesting how your presentation was. I was like, oh, I feel like they're giving me homework for when I'm there. But you know, what comes to mind for me is, well, first the quote that Srikant already gave us. I don't want to restate it. And another one was actually Albert Einstein tells us that if we look deep into nature, then we will understand everything better. And I think that that's a fantastic setup for going into this book. And I see that so very clearly in the way that you set up your presentation, Rob and Sherri, today. So I'm excited for diving deep into this with all of you. And I'm with Srikant. I'm looking at to me, the corollaries I see is, how do we apply this to our daily, walking, and how is this useful to us as humans, and how can we take bits of this and move forward with it? That's I see those pieces. And I guess that would be what is most attractive to me about Louis Sullivan. I'm not yet familiar enough with the others to make a commentary on whether or not they show that. When you asked your question, Srikant, the first thing that came to mind to me was what separates Louis Sullivan. To my very uneducated perspective, I'm going to put that disclaimer because I don't know the other two very well. The first thing that came to mind was his poetry. Something that strikes me almost as much as his philosophy is the beautiful manner in which he presents something so technical, and that's a fascinating thing to me. And I think we need more of that in our lives today. We need more. It's the idea that we are part of nature, not standing on the outside looking at it. And so I think that's something I have been working to see in everything around me and everything I do. Listening to you, Rob, this last thing you just said, I was like, maybe I'm going to start telling people I'm a naturalist by hobby. I like the sound of that. I'm just going to start, that's what I do for a hobby. I'm a naturalist. So that these are the things that come to mind for me, of just the way that this presentation, you guys set us up. It feels like we're going to start exploring some of these things. So I'm excited. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Now, would love to hear from everybody. So it's going to be Laura London, followed by Iris, Joe, Evanique, and Laura Shapiro. So Laura London, go ahead.
Hey, Yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation. But something that really stood out to me was the Bauhaus versus the Christopher Dresser's like toe stands. It seems like almost we like completely lost any whimsical sense connected to the Industrial Revolution or like the things we can create. Just became so soulless and lifeless and like kind of like cold.
Yeah.
Yeah. An aspect of the Bauhaus that I hadn't fully realized, I think maybe this comes out more in this is from reading Sherri's books on and by Mies van der Rohe, the architect, is that he had this very idea. His views on architecture were very collectivist, very much the industrial era is an era of collective action, and it's very much the sense that you are a cog in the machine. And Sherri talks about in architecture school, because she went sort of at the tail end of where it was very much Mies van der Rohe's program, being taught how to design these like 5x7 bathrooms that were all the same and everything had to be on a grid. And it was very much, you are a cog in the machine, you will get the bare minimum necessary for sustenance.
So it ends up actually that Bauhaus design, what you're seeing is very much part of their philosophy, where it isn't to have that individuality, it isn't to have that that level of of humor. And I think it's a sad thing to lose. And I don't know if everybody knows this. I went to an architecture school that was grew out of the Bauhaus in the US. And so I have taken that on and unpacked it fully. I fully understand the soullessness of some of that design work.
Yeah, I also,
Go ahead.
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the thoughts that I had that I wasn't like too confident to say because I know so little was that Bauhaus almost looks Soviet. So it's interesting to see that they actually had like a collectivist philosophy.
Yeah.
It's if you should read with caveats. I mean, I don't agree with everything in it, and I don't think he has much of an answer of his own. But the famous book From Bauhaus to Our House by Tom Wolfe.
Yeah.
And he talks about one of the ironies he talks about there is that the Bauhaus was supposed to be designing worker housing for a socialist paradise, and then ended up being used almost exclusively for corporate headquarters in New York City. In the big capitalist American city.
There's a whole nother seminar on that. Yeah.
All right. Next up is going to be Iris, followed by Joe. Iris.
Thought I was next.
Oh, Laura, yeah, go ahead. Please, Laura, please keep it brief. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I had a lot of things that I put in the chat, but one thing we should point out is that biology today is also becoming very important to botany because of climate change and all the effects that it's having. People have to start to study plants very carefully. So I just want to point that out. Another thing that I thought after I got every date wrong on all of those objects, I had to look up a few things. One thing that was really interesting about this is that department stores existed way back, but they mostly carried like, items for homes and farms and stuff. But the first one in London to carry clothing was this guy, Selfridge, and he really wanted to have an educated, rich kind of clientele. And he was really fascinated by science. So he had scientific exhibitions held in his department store, which also allowed him to raise the price on his items of clothing. And so he said, and he had fantastic time. And I think that was really the beginning of a movement that obviously didn't get carried on, but for the initiation of merchandise like that in a clothing store, that was fascinating to me that he did that. So that was one point. And the other point is that little teapot is still sold. That design is still sold in Italy today as a teapot of all the items that still exists. And finally, in Italy, they sell sheets of paper with ornamental designs on it. And it's the same size as the book, 24 by 18. And they sell sheets of paper. For what reason? Maybe wrap packages, but they still sell that in that manner, which is very historical, I think. So I'll leave all the others for people to read, which they're also sort of amusing little things, but I had a bunch of those. So I'll leave it at that. I'm keeping it short. Oh,
Thank
that's
you.
it.
Thank you very much, Laura, for sharing. And please add more in the chat. Really appreciate that. Next up is going to be Iris, followed by Joe. Iris.
Hi. Okay. I have a large library of ornamental books. I love the area. Done a lot of work myself. Let's see if I can do this so you can see it.
Oh,
This
yeah.
is a piece I've always loved. I never knew where it came from, and I just saw that it was dresser. And I grew up in Chicago. So as soon as I could walk, probably 2 or 3 years old, I was looking at Louis Sullivan's design at Carson Peary Scott. I loved everything about the building. The design went on into hidden areas that weren't meant to be seen by the customers, only by the clerks. I mean, it was just a real beauty, everything about it. Let's see. Oh, I have 2 books. My very best friend and I both loved ornament, and we were getting together every week, and suddenly she said, I'm not going to see you for a couple of months. I'm taking a course on antiques. And I thought, God, that's the last thing I'd be interested in. And a few days later, I was at Dover. Dover republished a lot of out of copyright books. And I discovered, I don't know which anymore, there's Styles of Ornament and Handbook of Ornament. And they both take you through all of recorded history and unrecorded history and show you different designs. And I just dedicated my life to that book. I read every plate, I read every word, I studied every part of the design. And I thought, oh, this is going to change our friendship, because everything I see from now on, I'll be able to give her this context that she doesn't have. We got together after a few months, and she said, the first thing I want to do is show you my textbook. Okay. And it was one of these 2 books. Neither one of us can remember which one was first, but she had done the same thing I had the same knowledge I did. And then we each immediately bought the other book and read through it as thoroughly.
I love that.
Thank you.
I had those books from my early days too.
Yeah, and there are a lot of books now. They're quite beautiful. There's this one on curves. I
Nice.
it only mentions one person by name. Everything else is just different styles, but not, it's not historical. You can't use it as a textbook, but it is full of beautiful things.
And just a touch here, in case anybody wants to look at Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament, and you can't get a local library nearby you, you can go to archive.org and search for it. They have, I don't know, a list of different scans of it. So some are brighter and some are dull, and some they take a scan of the tissue paper between the plates, which I don't know why, but they do. But you can take a look there and at archive.org, and you search for.
And these are scans of original editions.
Scans of the original folios, and you can zoom in on them. And so those images that I showed were from some of them, some of those scans. And so I've looked through several of them. It's a long book. It's like 600 pages, 300 to 600 pages, depending on how they scan it.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, Evanique, and Sam. Joe.
So thank you, Rob, and Sherri. It's great to see you. So it's good to have you back, and really appreciated that presentation. One of the things that actually had struck me is this idea of actually how Louis Sullivan looks for patterns in nature, and he looks for patterns in terms of trying to adopt certain principles that he can apply to his design. And it was interesting because when you were going through the Owen Jones, when I was thinking he brought all those cultures together, that he can kind of see the patterns design that exists across all these cultures. And I think that that's something that is, interesting because, and it's common to both of them, is that they can see the patterns and come up with their own principles of design within that framework. But anyway, that's my only observation. I thought it was excellent. I really did, and I'm excited to see you next week.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Evanique, followed by Sam, and then I'm going to ask panelists about, what are they looking forward to in, digging into System of Architectural Ornament, because Sherri said we can't talk about it. She has something to say, and we can talk only afterwards. But I want to have now panelists talk about how they are going to approach their own study of System of Architectural Ornaments after Evanique and Sam. Evanique, go ahead.
I just want to say, this is going to be really quick, but first of all, I missed you, Rob. I missed you, Sherri.
We missed you
both. So welcome back. The other thing I wanted to add was, I was noticing not only through the book, but through the pictures today, that the artwork really had a humanistic feel to it. It's like some of it mimicked the human body, and I just thought that was beautiful. And I think the interconnection with all these artists, between nature and human, and it just shows how we're all connected. And it's very interesting to see how the artists work that in. Even from like things like the teapot, like you said, Sherri, it was your mom holding her hands on her hips and being like, where are you? Like, where were you? Like, you're supposed to be here. Like, it brings that human element, and it shows like in nature, like even with the leaves. I think it was one picture of Louis Sullivan where you could see, like, I almost saw the form of a woman's body, like in the leaves and things of that nature. So I thought it was great, and I'm looking forward to this series, either live on replay. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evanique. Next up is going to be Sam, and then we'll go back to the panelists talking about how they're going to approach the book. Sam, go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I joined halfway through, so I missed the start. But it looks really good, so I'll have to catch up if Sherri can't upload this to YouTube. I had sort of an arbitrary question. Maritza, I heard you mention something about the V&A Museum, there being something that you were trying to see there, because I was actually going to go I live in London, so I was going to go to Kensington tomorrow, so I might try and check it out if you could let me know what it is.
Maritza, go ahead. Maritza, you can send it to me if you want. I'll send it to Sam. Whatever they want.
It's the books that Sherri and Rob were just discussing. It's those. So Louis Sullivan, this book here that we could get a free copy in PDF. They have a copy of that at the Victoria and Albert Museum. They have a copy of Owen Jones' book, and also several things of dressers.
And another important thing, if you're going to the V&A, make sure you stop in the Ironworks Hall, which most people just walk right through. They have that bench of dressers, which they won't let you sit on. But they also have some of Louis Sullivan's ironwork hanging on the wall. So make sure you check that out too.
We had an odd way to go through it because our youngest son, Oscar, is 13. He's just turning 14 in a couple of weeks. He has gotten into forging. And so he actually found an old antique, old hand crank forge back, like abandoned back behind our shop, and he fixed it up. And he's been firing up coal in there and got an anvil. So he's gotten into forging, and he spent a week
internship
as an internship at a local blacksmith here. So we take him to the V&A, and he I mean, his brain exploded
Oh,
in the ironwork section, because he talks about, look at what they did here. They twisted it, and then they did. And so he, because he knows enough about the techniques to be, his mind was blown at the complexity of the techniques that are being used, and he was very upset that everybody else was walking right through
it,
was paying attention.
So you need to hire him as your tour guide through the ironwork section. Trust me.
Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually really relevant at the moment to me because I'm doing a course and the first task is to design an ornament.
Perfect.
So, good inspiration.
Good, excellent.
Sam, I would recommend listening to the first part of this, what you missed, because that is all about, and most of it is from VNA. So a lot of it is from VNA. So just watch this and just go to VNA. Yeah. All right. Thanks. Iris, just a very quick comment because I want to go to the panelists. Go ahead, Iris.
Very fast. Something that I learned about just recently, actually scientists have just discovered, we're always being told to go out in nature, that, it'll help us be healthier. And they've discovered that people's reactions to fractals are the same as being in nature. It is as good for the body and spirit. So.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. I think I would just want to say that, my reaction to Sullivan's is the same. Sullivan's writing is the same to that of nature. And it is the same to that of fractals, because that's what he's doing. He's in this small things like form follows function. He's capturing a principle that can express itself as a fractal through your brain, through your hands, through your interactions with people, through everything that you make. So it is the fractal. And he captures that beautifully. All right, folks. So I want to now ask the panelist. No, let's go to the panelist, Laura. Go ahead, very, very quick. Go ahead.
I mentioned something about the design, fabric design. You basically create like a 12-inch piece and you repeat it throughout. One of the things why that tissue paper might have been there is if somebody wanted to trace one of those designs to then draw from it and work. So that's just some idea I had.
Thank you.
And the other, one more little thing, sorry. Oh, I wrote something and I can't read my writing, God damn it.
All right, Laura, let's hear the panelists talk about how they're going to approach this entire series. So let's see, Rupali already started talking about what she was going to do. So let me go to Rupali, and then Maritza, and then we'll go to Rob, and then finally Sherri. So Rupali, go ahead.
So I'm really excited about this series. I'm looking forward to it. There are three things. One is Louis Sullivan is talking about man's powers, and these are powers that we all possess. So I'd like to see, and I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to try this. I want to see if we can everybody here design something together. So my thought is that every week we'll do one little part of getting to the design. This is something I do in the school.
This is Rupali, this is fantastic idea. Sherri is thinking about this on the same lines. Just brainstorm with Sherri. The only thing I would say is that let's put some principles down so people can see how he's approaching it. Give a little bit of time, maybe a week or two, for people to get familiar with the book, and then we will integrate the exercises. But please work directly with Sherri to figure that out. Go ahead, Rupali.
So the first thing I would say is, like what Sherri said, everyone becomes a naturalist. Just go out, go for a walk, see something in nature, pick something you like. Why do you like it? Just take something and look at it really closely. Look at it from a distance, look at it closely. This you can do any time from now until next Saturday. Bring it to the meetup. The other thing that I did mention is that we'll do I'm going to focus on ornamentation in Indian architecture. There's just a lot in India that you can talk about. So that's my focus point. And then, we've recently got a laser cutter at our school, and our students have been really just going at it. They've been doing patterns, like they're designing patterns that, in Montessori classrooms, students have various objects that they can use to create their own designs, and they're making them on cardboard and leather and plywood or things like that. And I thought maybe we could try something if anybody is interested. It will be your own handmade thing with technology, but inspired by nature and yours to keep. So those are 3 things I wanted to share.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. Next up is Maritza, followed by Rob and Sherri. Sorry, Joia couldn't make it today, but she's going to be a regular panelist, and she's likely to focus on the literary elements as best as I know her. So Maritza, go ahead.
So, my very roughly thought out ideas. It's actually I'm laughing because I had a thought that I had rejected, but I'm bringing it back into play, listening to Rupali. My initial thought was like, how awesome would it be if I could make a poem out of these drawings being presented? And your word of the day, folks, is ekphrasis. And I'm sure I'm probably saying it wrong, so don't use my pronunciation of it. But that is when you take a visual work of art and you create literature out of it, or poetry, most often for poetry. And my thought was, I want to bring the feeling aspect into it from a perspective, and a couple other people who spoke commented it on, the humanity that is felt. And Shrikant, you often talk about the felt transformation. So I kind of want to pick up that phrase and kind of look at this work from that lens and see. And I don't have the technical expertise, so I'm gonna look at it again. For me, I'm looking at it from the philosophy of how can one individual use this for oneself, and I was thinking the idea of making some of this visual art into written art. So I don't know, I may do that for me and then share it with you guys. So those are just a couple of my very first thoughts, and I will probably also be commenting on the continuity of the works. And Sherri and Rob showed us that this design looks super unique, but this is something that's been thought of, and I suspect that if we pull out all of the architects that most keep drawing from nature, we'll find similarities. I think that's inevitable. And I believe that the same is true of us as humans. Those of us who most closely align ourselves with those things in nature, we're going to find that we just naturally have the same value system and maybe principles. And so I'm going to look towards pointing that out and finding how that works with this book, because knowing what I know already now of Sullivan's philosophy, I believe it's there. So I'll be looking for it.
Wonderful. Thank you. And folks, this is a very deep dive. And as we go deeper into it, we might completely morph what we're planning to do as we keep coming up with plans. So this is only the initial plans of everybody. Next up is going to be Rob.
Okay, so I just want to say I have, from my reading of Sullivan so far, I have a very clear idea of answer to Shrikant's question of what differentiates Sullivan.
Please go ahead and answer.
No, I'm not going to say it yet because I'm saving it for next week. But there is something really interesting that I was not expecting that I found in that text there. So I'm really looking forward to digging into that next time.
You guys are making a habit of this. I don't know what's going to happen next.
It's marketing, Shripant. You have
It's
to you have to leave something on the table, something that brings people coming back next week.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rob. Sherri.
Okay.
But the other thing I want to point out is that Sherri is also in this presentation wearing one of the mementos from our from the dresser exhibit that we saw 20 years ago. Which
You'll love these, Maritza.
It's a pair of earrings
They're
based on a like a leaf design.
a leaf design.
From Dresser that we bought at the V&A when 19 years ago when we saw this exhibit.
So I have I am really looking forward to this, because as an architecture student, we were given this book to read over and over. Architectural history, it was briefly, I mean, shockingly briefly passed over. And I kept feeling like I had this in my hands and going, but wait, we're not done here. So I'm really excited to be with a group of people that is excited to dive in a nice deep dive into this book. But I have a request, and that is that you grab some drawing paper and pencils, because as Rob, as a writer, Rob always talks about the importance of writing as a tool to improving your thinking. And Rupali and I have talked many times about this Montessori approach that you learn by doing. So I think it's absolutely imperative that we learn Sullivan's System of Architectural Ornament by drawing it. So I want us to go through slowly, one piece at a time. You don't have to draw well, but it's about putting the pencil to the paper and telling your brain telling you, where do you have to go next? What line do I make next? Because as we do that, I think we're going to have a much deeper understanding of how that ornament that Sullivan creates, how it comes from that first stem and that first seed germ. And I think we'll learn that by doing it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sherri. As for myself, I just love Louis Sullivan. I love this book, and like almost everything that you like this much, it has so much in it. And every time I go back to it, just reading by myself, I just find richer and richer and deeper things. And it's not about really reading, it's about internalizing things. And doing this in this group of people, not just the panelists, but then everybody else who participates, I think we did spectacularly well in our first two books on Louis Sullivan. And I think this promises to actually build on that, because we already have that as a base. And I think Sherri's idea and Rupali's idea of using the hand, so you have the full loop going in you, and internalizing these principles. What does it actually mean for a seed germ to be seed germ? Because the seed germ is something that actually can transform. If you just look at the seed, right? Look at the seed in a forest, what it is, right? It is taking in air. It is taking in even dead matter, and it is converting it. It is converting it into life. It is continuously focused on the sun. It is bathing in the light of the sun. But the light is also falling on a stone or a dead piece of wood, and it is doing nothing. The light bathes on it, and it grows towards the light, and it creates the forest. The seed is the seed of the forest. And that kind of fecundity in yourself, regardless of what is around you, given what is, using everything around you, is what is a vision of human beings, but even more deeper reality of human being. That's that that Louis Sullivan is talking about. And that is exactly what we're trying to achieve. So I'm very excited about it. And thank you, Sherri and Rob, for such a delightful and surprising way of getting us started and giving us the foundation, saying that, look at the seed of the seed. So thank you so much. And we'll see you next Saturday. These are going to be Saturdays at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So don't miss it. And if you do miss it, we do have it on video, but it's not the same. So we'll see you soon. Bye.